Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd spend some time this morning talking about how the virus has affected military operations around the world. And also, one of the questions I have on my mind, Jim, is did the American military spread the virus to China?
How? The scientists worldwide, especially in China, have been dissecting the virus. It's the genetic makeup of the virus. And one interesting thing was they found out that 80% of it was SARS. And the other 20%, they're still trying to figure out where they came from. But the current operating theory is that the Wuhan virus, or whatever you want to call it, was basically a merger of two viruses, two flu viruses, shall we say, or COVID viruses. COVID means, out of animals. And they don't know what animal or what person, most likely an animal, it combined, an animal that does not develop, fatal symptoms like many of these diseases. They're benign in the original host, but once it jumps over to humans, Katie barred the door. But that's what they suspect happened. Now, it's a telling factor in China. Well, there's many telling factors. They officially outlawed, this was a month ago, the live animal marketplaces, which have been growing enormously in China with the greater wealth in the country. People can afford to buy these exotic, delicacies and eat them. That has been a classic method of transferring these COVID viruses for centuries, for thousands of years. I mean, measles, for example, they've traced back to some extinct wild buffalo in Central Asia, so we can't pin that one on the Chinese. But it apparently popped up in the Roman Empire several times, doing a great amount of damage. And now, of course, we still have it. But the problem is that China was always the vector of that. And they don't like that because it reflects poorly on China. But they know it. I mean, the Chinese know it. The government knows it. But the government's trying to spin this as some sort of foreign conspiracy. But, I think they should face the fact that they have met the enemy and just look in the mirror. The Chinese are aware of that more so than the government. This is causing a great deal of unrest in China. Hong Kong has been jumping all over this. They've kept it under control in their tight little city. But they've been saying you can't trust the Chinese, meaning the Chinese government. And that call has been basically spreading to southern China, and it may go farther. Now, the government's doing all it can to basically suppress this. It's Tiananmen all over again. And it's especially acute for the current Chinese government because Chairman Xi has declared himself, before this all started, as another Mao, which I think was a bad analogy, but it flies better in China, at least did. And he's president for life. No more, 5 years, we select another guy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Chinese had no say in this, but they don't like it, and they don't like the way Xi is dealing with the COVID-19, because he's saying things are all better now, and we have fewer of everything. But that's not what the Chinese people are saying. Now, the Chinese are going to great lengths to suppress this kind of, rhetoric, but they can't really keep it all out. The Great Firewall of China, which they spend billions of dollars a year on, trying to control the electronic flow of information, is not 100%. It's probably not even 90%, because especially in times of stress, people go to great lengths to find information and spread it. And it is spreading. And it is not good for Xi. So he's got another problem there, speaking of, impact on the military, because Xi, over the last few years, gone to great lengths to remind the Chinese military that they swearing an oath to him, to the Communist Party, not to China. And his worst fear is that the troops will begin to say, "Well, no, wait a minute. What are we really here for? Defending some clueless emperor, or defending China?" So there you go. Its impact on the military in China is probably the potentially greatest. In the rest of the world, it's like chemical warfare. I've been mentioning this for years, in How to Make War books back in the 80s, that the real reason, or the main reason, practical reason, that chemical weapons were outlawed was because it messed up the control over the troops. It was like the current, COVID-19, a panic weapon. It basically froze people into mobility. And of course, we have a classic example of that here in the United States, that we've shut the economy down, and there's already, the president is talking about the cure is worse than the disease, which in the long term, or maybe even the short term, is probably true. But at the same time, if you look at other parts of the world, where they don't have these health systems, like I say, when it all blows over, they say, well, gee, there were more people dying last year. Well, so what? That happens. So knowledge is power, but sometimes it's also a source of panic. And I think that's what we're seeing with COVID-19. Indeed, now New York, where in February, the CDC was talking about, flu is going to continue to be a greater source of deaths, which it is every year, than COVID-19. That may not be true now, but it's not over yet. And what they're waiting on is whether or not, and Austin, Texas may be the test bed for this, is whether, like most flus, it is weather dependent. Flu was always the disease that was the flu season. Starts in the November, December, whatever, and it goes on for about 4, 5, 6 months, and that's when most of the deaths occur. But as it gets warmer, it just doesn't spread, and it doesn't completely go away, but it diminishes enormously. So that's what we're waiting on now. What is it? 90 degrees down in Austin?
It hit 90 briefly, I think, a couple of days ago, and it got into the mid 80s yesterday. I'm not sure what's going to happen.
And nobody's complaining about global warming at this point. Saying, bring it on. The more heat, the better. But I think the CDC is keeping an eye on hot parts of the United States where you do have COVID. You do have some of it down in Texas. Well, it's in one of the big cities, or a couple of the big cities.
Yeah, Jim, it's. I heard on one of the local news stations yesterday afternoon the number of cases in really the central Texas, Travis County and the surrounding counties, but I didn't go back and look at it. I don't remember what it was, and I don't want to misstate it, but it's not that many. Given the fact
most of it's in New York City, which says a lot of things.
Yeah, I know. But you see, the greater the metropolitan statistical area that this draws on has over 2 million people in it.
Yeah.
But it's the thing is it's with the exception of downtown Austin, where now there are a lot of condominium apartments, and it's high density. Most of the area is rather low density, particularly when you get out towards the hill country or start dropping down to heading south towards San Marcos or north of Georgetown. And that's the low density is one of the reasons you're even when you're being mobile in a low density situation, you don't have as much of a problem as you do in like living in Manhattan. And I lived in Manhattan 8 years. You can't avoid it. I know, and not that you even that's just what comes with the territory and living in a high density urban area like New York City. The deal is though. You can. I know anecdotally of about 6, 7 cases, and they were picked up the thinking is trying to trace it back. They either picked it up shopping or attending a meeting of some sort, and that can happen wherever you are, including on an aircraft carrier. And that's the thing. So, let me add one other thing, that COVID is a an acronym for coronavirus disease. But Jim, you're right. It affects animals, birds, and mammals, and we're primates. Primates can get coronavirus. We do, and I would guess, I'm taking a wild shot on this, that chimps, orangs, and gorillas can as well. That's they're a threat.
Yeah. Well, that's where we got the AIDS. It was apparently around in Africa for thousands of years, but only in monkeys. But as the population expanded, and people normally didn't hunt monkeys because they organize and fight back, but they bushmeat, as they call it, slaughtered monkeys became more popular, and bingo, suddenly you've got AIDS all over the place, and then it eventually jumps to other parts of the world. But that was something I remember. There was a when I was working with the CIA years ago, there was a woman there, a doctor they called Dr. Death, and her main area of expertise was studying this phenomenon, which they were well aware of. Now, they worked apparently, in conjunction with CDC and what have you, to track the potential appearance of new unknown diseases, because these are the ones that kill you, as the saying goes. And they were seeing Africa as the source of a lot of diseases that have always been there, but have never jumped to humans. And, of course, as bushmeat became more popular, bingo, AIDS. Ebola came that same way. Ebola had been there for years. And as you get more people living closer together, you get more transmission, and suddenly it becomes noticed. I mean, the Germans noticed that, in the 1960s when they discovered Marburg virus. And I think that's one of the things that set off the CIA. Said, "Oh my God, here's something that is a unknown, which is now becoming known, and it's scary." But the thing is, you can develop, vaccinations for it, which they've done with the flu, which cuts the death rate by more than half if you get enough people to take the shot. But the other thing you got to keep in mind, and this is the Diamond Princess experiment, as it were, that cruise ship. Where they basically had all those people in confined spaces, no real efforts to keep anything, the infection spreading, and 80% of the people didn't get it. Now, that's fairly typical for influenza-type diseases. It doesn't affect everybody. Most people have immune systems or whatever that can resist it, and they never even catch it. But the 20% who did get it, half of them never showed symptoms. Now, they're the worst ones. They're the typhoid Marys. They can walk around until it finally gets out of their system, never knowing they never know it was there. But they can breathe on a lot of people who are more vulnerable, and bingo, you've got transmission, which is why, I go along with this business in New York. The streets are empty. It's amazing. And the ability to detect and to develop, vaccines is our best defense. And what people are worried about is we won't get something developed quickly enough to prevent a lot of the damage from the first wave of the coronavirus. But that's the trend in medicine. Now, again, getting back to the chemical warfare analogy, what's happening with armed forces around the world, at least the ones who care about this, and a lot of them don't. I mean, especially in Africa, where most of the armed forces are independent militias doing whatever the hell they want. They probably won't even notice it because unless it's got a huge death rate, which it doesn't. It's nothing like the bubonic plague hitting Europe, or the plague of Justinian, or the Augustine, the 2nd century A.D. Measles outbreak apparently in Rome, which killed a huge chunk of the population. Not as much as the plague of Justinian, but again, that one hit in more concentrated, more urban areas where it did enormous damage. Constantinople was particularly hit, but they had no way of basically developing an antidote, which we do. So with the bad news comes the good news, and part of the good news is with in the rush to develop vaccines for COVID-19 means the FDA, the American FDA, which has always been considered, more of an obstacle than a facilitator of finding new cures. There are layers and layers of restrictions, safety values, safety measures are being stripped away, and they're hustling into testing without going through all the layers and layers of preliminary testing, which the FDA normally approves. So I suspect the first, COVID virus vaccine will be issued with the caveat there may be unforeseen side effects. And so people have to decide, do I risk the unforeseen side effects, even if I know what some of them are, or do I maybe take the shot, and count my blessings if I survive it? But for the militaries, they are of the major powers. Their militaries are basically immobile. Not saying they're absolutely useless at this point, but the United States, for example, has frozen everything in place. The only places where they are basically out and about, and then only when necessary, is places like Iraq, to a lesser extent Afghanistan. And we're depending more and more on the military actions that don't require human intervention, the human contact, namely, the surveillance, drone surveillance, and then using missiles when you find someone that you really want to, get rid of. And that may speed up that form of warfare if you're going to have to face more and more of these, how should I put it, unpredictable new diseases. I don't know if that'll have a long-term effect right away, but it'll make generals think, we got to be careful. That was what kept, again, things like that are what kept the Europeans out of Africa until the 19th century. We talk a lot about, for example, American slavery. The slaves that the Americans, slave traders brought to the United States were already slaves when they were purchased. They could trade at these coastal areas where there was less disease, nothing like a fresh sea breeze. That's why they call it healthy. But it wasn't until after the slave trade was outlawed, at least by the British, in the 1830s, that Europeans developed anti-malaria medicine. Malaria was the big killer, still is. That they could advance further in and basically establish colonies. So the colonies lasted less than a century. Of course, they're blamed for every ill that now afflicts Africa, but as we explained in the strategy page, that's not the case. But it is a big, how should I put it, danger for military forces. The classic example was the several 100,000 French troops that were sent to put down yet another uprising in Haiti, and almost all of them died from disease, not from fighting the rebels. And the Haitians still celebrate that. I've never got into the details of what exactly they celebrate, but that was a problem throughout the Caribbean. In fact, 94% of the enslaved Africans were sent to those areas because they died less quickly than the Europeans did. Again, because they had some resistance to tropical diseases, but they weren't immune. And that is still the case. That some places have a how should I put it, a geographic edge in dealing with these diseases. That's why I'm saying, I mentioned that in Austin, you should keep track of, how since they're testing people who have it, if it starts to plummet with the temperatures going up, that's really good news nationwide, because it means if we have a early, very warm spring, that means that there's less chance of the accelerated spread of the COVID-19.
Jim, I just did something I don't usually do during a strategy talk. I went to the computer to look up the number of reported cases in the state of Texas. And as of yesterday, there were 974 cases reported statewide, with 12 deaths associated with. You get what I'm saying, right?
Yes, indeed.
Associated with it. Now, Travis County yesterday and there were 98 cases in Travis County, and going around looking at the surrounding counties, I'm trying to remember what was said on the conversation and on the talk show, but I know the Central Texas number was somewhere around 100. Okay, so that most of it here in Travis County, where Austin is, and on the Travis County page this morning, it's up from 98 to 119 cases reported, but it looks like there haven't been any deaths in the last 24 hours anywhere.
Well, see, this is something important to take note of. Based on the Diamond Princess data, which is, again, the only, pure, test as we've had as the overall impact of the COVID-19, I came up with a rule of thumb on that, where for every death, it's the deaths you've got to keep an eye on. And even though some of those will be missed because some of them might be misinterpreted as the common flu. For every death, that means there are 1,000 people infected. So when they say there were 200 people, died in New York City, that means there were 200,000 cases of it, because there have to be about 1,000 cases to generate one death. So the testing is incomplete. It always will be, because they're turning out these tests, these COVID-19 tests as quickly as they can, but they're not going to ever be able to test everybody in every area. So I depend upon the rule of thumb of the COVID-19 deaths. Now, those are more likely to be caught, because most of these people are going to die in a hospital, and the tests are available, and I think they can, and they are testing people who die from anything remotely similar to COVID-19 to see if this person died of COVID-19. And that's why you get a more accurate thing. Now, 200,000 cases in New York is not, unreasonable, because this is, as you can say, a concentrated city, and we really didn't get on top of it, until February, so it had plenty of time to spread. They ultimately, at first they poo-pooed, the president who banned early on incoming flights from China. Now they're saying, well, that was a wise move, quietly. And the rest of the country didn't have much of an opportunity to get infected, because the main vector, the source, was China. And other countries are doing the same thing. I mean, they basically picked up on this, before the rest of the world had accepted it as, face value, even though it was clear that the damn thing had broken out first in Hubei County province, and especially the city of Wuhan, the capital. And that's where the majority of the deaths still are. And of course, that's what the Chinese are complaining about. The government's issuing press releases about, oh, it's over, it's peaking, et cetera, and they're ordering factories to start up. They're opening movie theaters, which suspiciously nobody is attending. And there are stories coming out about factories which were ordered to reopen. The workers wouldn't show up. And there was one story about factory managers who are basically turning on the equipment, and because the government was monitoring electricity usage, so they tried to make it look like they were back in production. But the weather satellites, non-Chinese, are monitoring pollution over China, and they're noticing that pollution is still way down. Now, that's what happens when you're actually producing stuff, not just cranking up the electricity, turning on all the devices, as it were, in the factory, but not pumping out any of the byproducts, the toxic byproducts that these factories normally turn out. So the government of China may be declaring victory, but the people are saying, no, The war is still on. Now, whether or not it's going to, peak and decline with warm weather, that's something else. A lot of the epidemiologists, the medical statisticians are keeping an eye on, because that again seems to be the best indicator that it's going to peak. Even the 1918 influenza, although it went on for 2 years, that was 2 flu seasons. But in between, it declined again because even that influenza would not spread as readily during the warmer weather. You had to wait for things to cool off before this damn thing got going again, and it did so for 2 seasons. Now, it's also true that the common influenza, the normal influenza, which varies somewhat, considerably in terms of its spread and the number of fatalities, also does that. And in many years, you'll have 2 or 3 strains of influenza running around. By the way, I checked with my siblings, just double checked. I never got the flu. I mean, that doesn't mean I am not a Typhoid Mary, because they never test people who don't get it. Maybe they do. I haven't been able to find any research on that. I haven't dug that deep, really. I haven't had the time. I'm still working. My factory isn't shut down. The thing is, we really don't know. That's why the Diamond Princess was so important. These poor people didn't realize they were going to be such a useful, predictive tool for COVID-19. But that's the way it was, because they were stuck for 2 weeks with all this COVID-19 air circulating throughout the ship. They were still gathering in dining rooms to eat. Before they let these people off the ship, they tested everybody. And that's where you've got a more or less definitive answer on just how many people get it, how many people die from it, and how many people are asymptomatic. And they're the most dangerous ones, which is why they should keep testing, because, yes, you've got to find people who've got it, who have no symptoms whatsoever. They're the ones you want to keep inside, because they see no reason to, stay inside. But they're basically the worst risk in terms of spreading the damn thing, just like the classic Typhoid Mary, which is very rare but not unknown for any disease, for people asymptomatic but are basically pumping out the disease with every breath they exhale.
Hey, Jim, I want to answer Dan's question about the U.S. Army spreading the disease in Wuhan, because he started off with that Chinese agitation propaganda lie, and you didn't take the bait on it.
Oh yeah,
I want to take the bait. I want to take the bait.
Exercise, yeah.
Yeah, Dan, that lie first appeared, according to a article I read about 4 or 5 days ago, in a People's Liberation Army newsletter on a website in January. And it developed a little bit. I'm always, sometime I'd like to know how they evolve some of their plot lines, because they're writing fiction. It's big lies, and they tell them often. Like Joseph Goebbels' admonition: "Tell the big lie, tell it often." That's the way you jam propaganda. Jam it down the throats all over the world. But this, the accusation was that U.S. Army soldiers who were participating in an exercise, it was a competition. And I remember reading about this on one of the defense websites. It may have been in the Institute for Defense Analysis newsletter at the time. And it was in Hubei province, Wuhan area, and it took place in October. So they take something that's a fact in October, that there were some U.S. soldiers participating in this competition. And that became, all right, that's true. Now, they brought the virus. There's absolutely no evidence for that. As President Trump says, they know where it came from, meaning Beijing, and its propagandists know where it really came from.
Yeah, what they're really trying to suppress is the fact that their doctors detected it in early December.
Exactly, and it's Jim. There's evidence, and look, one of the first people I heard this from was in Thailand. It was Michael Yan and I were on Skype together, and he was in Thailand in January, and talking to several Thai doctors about this disease that was already showing up in Thailand because Chinese vacationers on Chinese New Year had gone to Thailand. And one of the MDs that he had interviewed the day before, and he was going to talk to him again down in who was in Bangkok, advised the Thai government on epidemics, and this MD already had a pretty good picture of what this disease was like and epidemic. And he says, it's down here there's just too many Chinese visitors, and it's back, and there was already an indication that Wuhan was the epicenter of it. I'm going to say that we had this conversation maybe the 12th, 13th, 14th of January, something like that. So
I wonder if they tested those American troops who were over there for that exercise.
That's a good question to ask in retrospect. But
I mean, they kind of say it's a cover-up, but see if any of them had it, because I think they have tests now where they'll detect antibodies in a person who is long since past the exposure to say that they actually had it at one point. But I suspect that would show that, no, these guys were perfectly healthy. In fact, these were the healthiest soldiers we could send because it was a competition.
All right, some of this is speculation, but it's speculation that now there was good intuition by MDs and epidemiologists that the first cases actually showed up sometime in late November in Wuhan.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And the incubation period, you hear initially, it's 4 or 5 days. Well, there were already MDs, including one of the people in Thailand, saying, it might be 2 weeks, given. Well, all right. You see, the thing is, you're going back, and some of this is again, we can classify it as informed gossip, since I've given you, the sources on it, and there were MDs seeing patients, talking to them about where they'd come from, how they'd felt, and applying their own, experience to it. Say, wait a minute, we don't know yet. You'd get a lot of that, but let me tell you what I'm seeing. And this is not somebody trying to scare people. It's somebody trying to pass on, what his direct experience with these patients. But here's the thing. By the end of January, the Chinese are already beginning their propaganda campaign to try to save face. We know what they did. They tried to suppress knowledge of, and they flat out denied that there was an epidemic there. There were plenty of conscientious doctors in Wuhan, including that Dr. Lee that I wrote about a column in early February, and it turned out the day the column was published, we learned a couple of days later he died from the coronavirus. But he's one of the 2 MDs in December who put something on the internet in China about their experiences with these ill people in the Wuhan hospitals. The government shut it down. The government detained Dr. Lee, and he had to recant, saying that he'd told shameful lies. Of course he hadn't. The Chinese Communist Party government suppressed the warnings of these MDs, and there's that right there is delayed a global analytic response if they'd begun sharing what they had, the RNA and DNA, but it's a virus. It's most of them is RNA, but they're the genetic code for the disease that their patients had there in Wuhan. the delay, how long is that delay that is due to the dictatorship? 3 weeks? Looks to me more like 6 weeks. And yet they're the ones who've been telling us, and she is, he's the emperor now, but he's also was going to, China was going to be on top. By 2049, China would be the global superpower. And the liberal international order, this is their kind of made-up term for what the United States runs. They claim it's a manufactured idea, but it would be replaced by their authoritarian model because they're far more efficient and they can get things done. The coronavirus outbreak, the epidemic, the pandemic that is traceable to their own ineptitude and their own dictatorial narcissism is really what it is on them, and they know it. The other point that has puzzled me, even though I understand it, and I think it's traceable back to Chinese Communist Party propaganda, saying Wuhan virus is racist. And yet the American mainstream media in January and February, there's even a Washington Post headline talking about Wuhan virus. If that is racist, Jim, is St. Louis encephalitis racist? What is that? I know, or Lyme disease. I had a little fun in this week's column. West Nile virus. Now, West Nile's a province in Uganda. I spent 10 or 11 days in West Nile province in an Aler ethnic group. The Aler tribe is the dominant ethnic group in West Nile province. I was there 10 or 11 days, little village near the town of Nebi. Now, where's the outrage on West Nile virus? There wasn't any. I see the Chinese propaganda apparatus is the one that has pushed this, and what is so, it's not amusing, it's sad, is to see major media organizations, outlets here in the United States repeat it. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Dan. You know what? That slurs Colorado and Utah, doesn't it? I think it does. I mean, you've got the Rocky Mountains there in Utah, don't you?
Oh,
I believe
we do. A lot of them.
Yeah, I know you do. Yeah, and Wyoming. It slurs Western Canada. New Mexico as well. Wuhan virus. That's where it came from, and it is a smear on the United States to say American soldiers brought it to Central China.
Yeah, but the worst problem for China is the Chinese aren't believing this, and that's what bothers Xi.
I know, that's good. I believe that it is so outrageous that nobody's believing it other than the White House press corps. That's it. And I'm being a bit extreme on that. I know we don't do that on Strategy Page, but I've been watching some of these press briefings, not wall to wall, and it's the carping and the shame. You shouldn't say this. You shouldn't say that. What? We're dealing with a huge crisis. It has health dimensions, medical dimensions, and now economic dimensions. And part of the economic dimensions are the supply chains that, yes, we did allow supply chains to move to China. And now we're looking at medicines that are manufactured in China that we need to be able to manufacture here, I'll say in North America. You can make it in Mexico and Canada as well as the United States. Needs to be brought back, as well as some of the other manufacturing elements, especially when it goes in to our defense industrial base. And Dan, this is something that is instructive about this pandemic. Is that are you going to rely on, first of all, a dictatorship that doesn't really care about its own people, that really cares about its own face? I'm going to use the cultural term, but its own image more than anything else. And as Jim was saying earlier before we started recording, there's been evidence that a lot of the Chinese medical devices are defective. That's cropping up in testing, and I'll let Jim talk about that. But I'd read that as well. We had a lot of visits. I saw in the last couple of days to that article Jim wrote about the Chinese attack helicopters and their inadequate engines, and they don't manufacture to the quality of Western manufacturers, particularly in aircraft. Jim has doubts about the quality of some of their ships as well. And yet they tout themselves as the future. I think this is an insight into why the Chinese Communist Party is not the future. And Jim, if their own people aren't believing it, and I've read the same reports, the people in Wuhan saying that they're lying, as the senior officials will go around saying we're reopening for business. We'll find out. It's hard to control information in the 21st century. And
another factor is the Chinese pay more attention to history, especially their own, than people, especially in the United States. And one thing they've always recognized is that empires fall when they lose the mandate of heaven, meaning the people no longer worship the emperor as being the benevolent or basically the guy who will save them from internal and external problems. And that's how the Chinese justify the overthrow of the Sung Empire, which is actually the proto Democrats in China who lost out, the nationalists in 1910. But they basically picked up the mantle, as it were, and they basically made a lot of big mistakes. And these have not been forgotten. Like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in the 60s killed tens of millions. And I think Xi is concerned that the people will be, running out of patience for the current empire dynasty, and this could be, eventually there's going to be something, a mistake too far, and they're concerned that the way they handled the Wuhan virus may be the one. That's what they fear more than anything else. I mean, they feel if everything goes okay, yes, they will eventually become the superpower, the preeminent superpower on the planet. But they can't do that if they're no longer in power. And of course, a lot of Chinese scholars say this is the reason why China fell so far behind the West in the first place, that you had emperors who were looking over their shoulder, not forward. And the Chinese thought they had that beat, but maybe they don't. Because, something like this, these biological threats are something that does terrible things to armed forces. Historically, like the example of the French or Western armies in general, troops being sent to the Caribbean, this was considered a death sentence. If your regiment was posted to Jamaica or something like that, whoops. And of course, the British learned from that lesson, and they basically took extraordinary measures to try and keep the troops healthy in these places. But the French and Haiti were basically the major indicator of what happens if you're reckless and don't pay attention. You will lose an entire army without many shots being fired. And that is still seen as something that will cause tremendous changes in the balance of power. For example, in World War I, one of the reasons that the Russians lost, even though they had on paper in World War I, they had greater numbers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they couldn't control what they call the sanitary threat. For example, in World War II, they kept the actual losses to Russia, which were about 29 million. They said it was only 10 million. Well, it turned out that's something that came out, documented in the 1990s when the KGB, when the state archives were open momentarily for a few years. You could get a lot of good stuff out. And they actually, why? We own it. We'll publish it. And they published, copies of those documents. And 2/3 of the deaths in World War II were sanitary losses, as they called it. And these were primarily civilian deaths due to disease and deprivation. Now, a lot of those you can pin on the Germans because they'd move into an area and they'd take over any housing, any food, et cetera, and the civilians had to fend for themselves, and a lot of them died. And that's where a lot of those, those 19 million sanitary losses came from. But the Russians had it figured out earlier than any other Western army that these sanitary losses are the big killer. And, of course, that's how they defeated Napoleon in 1812. Don't fight him. Just keep retreating. And the further he goes into Russia, through this scorched earth area where there's no shelter, there's no food, they will die. And indeed, Napoleon's 500,000-man army, only a few thousand, eventually escaped. So that was a classic example of using that approach. But in many cases, you're not at war with anybody when one of these unknown diseases breaks out, but you're still going to pay the price. And militaries have always been very, how should I put it, vulnerable because they concentrate a lot of people in small areas, and they still need supplies, and they can't completely isolate themselves. And that's why, the U.S. Army, the U.S. military has basically been shutting down, keeping everybody restricted bases, taking extreme measures to protect the most valuable aspect of any military, your trained manpower. And that's something the Chinese, I don't know what the casualties have been in the military, but the North Koreans are, of course, they're not saying anything. But again, information gets out, even in a place like North Korea, and it is spreading. And they're just simply trying to prevent the spread, because the transportation network in North Korea was in a bad shape before, and it's been getting worse. But because of they allowed market economy, you had the Dojin, the entrepreneurs, the legal entrepreneurs. They were all over the place, as were the Chinese entrepreneurs, coming in and they're trading with the North Koreans. Well, now the Chinese are all gone. Chinese withdrew them, not willingly, but gladly, because they figured if there's any place you're going to die from this, it's going to be in North Korea, where there's no medical care like they have in China. But at the same time, the North Koreans are aware of the fact that they do not have the medical facilities to deal with something like this. They're just going to experience a big die-off. Not as bad as they experienced in the 1990s when they lost over 10% of the population to starvation and related diseases. But they're going to take a big hit. And again, the problem is going to be, you've got the Kim dynasty in North Korea. They are losing the mandate of heaven, as they say, and I don't know if I don't think we've run this piece yet. They got a piece coming out that they have a case system in North Korea, as they do in all communist countries. The Russians sort of invented that. You were classified once the rebels took over as to your family's actual and potential loyalty in the future, and you were branded for life. As a bourgeois proletariat family. Therefore, you're not going to get into university, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing in North Korea, but now they're changing that, and they're going to basically reshuffle the entire deck. Everybody is going to be examined and be assigned a new case, as it were. And that's probably going to mean a lot of the upper class people are going to end up in the lower case. And moving forward, they're going to try and enforce that. Now, they haven't got the tools the Chinese have, but the Chinese are even discovering that their social usefulness score, I forget exactly what the term translates as, with all the Big Brother, the video cameras, the face recognition, et cetera, being able to track everybody's cell phone location, that is incomplete because, as we discovered, or as I discovered early on and noted, that the corruption fights against that, because people who have the money, they can pay to basically spruce up their score. And this is something the North Koreans are even less capable of doing, and the corruption is growing to epidemic proportions over the last decade. And that's one reason for changing the Sungmung system, because they're finding out the most loyal families are generating an unseemly number of obviously disloyal, people. So there's going to be some long-term effects of this virus. Whether or not it kills a lot of people, it's basically making a lot of people aware of the fact of whether or not they can trust their government. And this is what, in the United States and even throughout the Western world, governments are realizing, we have to face up to, failures and make good as quickly as possible. Otherwise, well, you're losing elections. And we got a big one coming up in this fall in the United States. So that'll be another social experiment we'll all participate in. But China, even without elections, and they really haven't had a nationwide democracy ever in China, but that may be the thing that eventually gets China a democracy, because the people realize that the only ones who can really should be making decisions, big decisions, are the people it most affects. And of course, China was concerned that if they created this huge middle class, which they have done, they basically reduced abject poverty from something like over 60% to less than 10%, in the last 20 years. That's a major achievement you don't hear much about, but it means a whole lot for China. But at the same time, the way they implemented it, they created this genie, which tends to destroy dynasties, and they can't put it back in the bottle. So I think the long-term impact of the Wuhan virus, or whatever you want to call it, is already underway in China, and it's not looking too good for the dynasty. As for the rest of the world, well, to a greater or lesser extent, some countries are dealing with it much better than others. Comparatively, statistically, the United States is handling it quite well. Nobody wants to say that, at least not in the media, because that's not news. That's not going to get you eyeballs, but when the dust settles and you look at the numbers, say, hey, we did pretty good.
Jim, we're doing some absolutely superior broken field running. I mean, changing anesthesiologists' apparatus, into ventilators with by changing a couple of valves. That was an anesthesiologist apparently thought of that about 10 days ago. I heard this discussed in the president's briefing yesterday, the question about it, and now it's already being done. I mean, that is an intelligent individual who understood how I'm trying to remember the specific name for it, but it goes over a patient's face to administer anesthesia, gas anesthesia, and just reverse it. Now you've got a respirator. You can do that in a free enterprise democracy like the United States because we're adaptable. And we look for ideas and we don't try to suppress them. Well, I know sometimes they get suppressed by regulations, big business, big government, but in a time of crisis, we can respond. And
yeah,
we're doing
it's the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah, exactly. I want to make one other point, too, that I thought you were going to get onto it a moment ago when you were talking about health of military organizations. Listen, field sanitation. The United States is a field sanitation power. You don't think about it. You do think about it if you've ever been in a tactical unit and deployed. And because senior NCOs are going around saying, no beards, shave, short hair. Well, that already goes with it. Cleanliness, take what that would be called colloquially a whore's bath, a whore's shower, wash yourself off under the arm. That's the term for it, guys. Jim, I know you've heard it. And you're washing under your armpits and various other places in your body. Wash your hands. Keep yourself as clean as possible. Medic check. That's going on when you're in the field, and of course the same kind of thing. And garrison morning formation. It's a time for the NCO and officers to find out if somebody's sick. Yeah. That's one of the things that goes on with it.
If you look at the history of military medicine, the United States was one of the not the only one, but one of the leaders in that area.
Absolutely.
Because during the Civil War, it was noted we were keeping a lot of statistics, and we noticed that in all previous wars, you were losing more men to non-combat, causes, disease, and sanitary problems in general. And that started changes even into the even during the Civil War, and of course by the time World War I came along, I think it was the first major war where more troops were lost to combat than to non-combat causes, and that escalated even into World War II. Now the Russians still had the attitude, well, if we can't do all that stuff, they knew about it and they did implement it when they could, but when they couldn't, they said, well, we'll just lose a lot of troops. And that's why they suppressed the number of losses to non-combat causes in World War II, because many of I don't know what the exact I have the I think I have an English translation. My Russian isn't good enough to pour through that book, but I think a large proportion of the sanitary losses were troops. Now they did give priority to the soldiers for food and medical care and what have you. But in the field, if they couldn't implement the sanitary rules that we know about from being in the American military, they simply say, all right, we'll take our extra losses and we'll consider them combat losses. But they're not really. They're just losses you couldn't afford to prevent, outside of the battlefield. And you're simply accepting because, things must go on. But in a major war, that is still a major threat. That's why you're seeing so many losses in Africa in the wars, the irregular wars they've been suffering, for decades now. That so many of the people with weapons organized are not disciplined. And they are basically looking after themselves. But hey, if they do something that starts a epidemic among the civilian population, some of their guys are going to get it. But they just haven't learned that lesson yet because they're thinking like brigands, not like soldiers.
All right, we learned it. We learned it early. And there was another thing too. You were talking about tropical diseases. Look at the push that the U.S. Army made about yellow fever, and of course,
Panama Canal. Yeah.
Oh no! All right. There's a concern about it. It's first of all, it's a democracy being concerned about voters. I'm be semi-cynical with that. But secondly, no, you want to keep your units together so they can serve as go to combat healthy. That's not cynical. That's the job, and that's why it is cheeky to say, hey, the U.S. military is a field sanitation power, but it is. And a lot of the things that say, oh, look, they're being martinets, marching around and all that. I'm talking about the leftist critique. A lot of that stuff comes into it, not only staying in shape, but also keeping people healthy. And they don't know that because they've never been in and they don't pay any attention. No, they don't know.
Well, in World War II, that was a major weapon we used against the Japanese. For example, in Guadalcanal, we spent a lot of effort keeping the Japanese from getting any supplies. They would have to run it down at night, on fast ships. They converted destroyers to, food and supply transports. And that's where President Kennedy got run over at night in his big T-boat. They were patrolling, looking for these guys to put a torpedo into these fast transports, and one of them ran them down at night because nobody had any lights on. But this worked because eventually the Japanese nickname for Guadalcanal was Starvation Island. Because if you're sent there, you're more likely to die from starvation and disease than from enemy bullets. And of course, even for Americans, it was pretty tough. But we had much lower losses, sanitary losses, as the Russians call it, than the Japanese did. And eventually, when we made the big push, the Army, the Marines were long gone, throughout the island to mop up the remaining Japanese, they found a lot of them They were there, but they couldn't even lift the rifle because they were so wiped out by disease and hunger and what have you. And that's where we took most of our prisoners.
Well, gentlemen, we're out of time, and there were actually some other topics I wanted to bring up, and maybe we'll have to do this again in 2 weeks. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.
Okay,
Bye,
take
guys.
care. Bye-bye.